John Crotty, thanks very much for joining me.
Thank you, John. Really appreciate it.
There's this broad but fairly multi-pronged accusation that gets made about Ireland in the kind of mid 1900s, which is that the country was during World War II not only pro-Nazi but anti-Semitic. Two things that go very much hand in hand, but are different claims. It's something that you could be forgiven for thinking if you've only scratched the surface, in terms of your reading, or if you've only heard a few little snippets, such as the Sean Russell thing, the IRA collaborating with the Nazis, or even worse, when you discover that Eamon DeVelera sent condolences to Germany after Hitler's death, literally one of the most evil men in at least modern history. Terrible in hindsight, but when you do more than scratch the surface, you actually discover like a mountain of evidence pointing to the opposite. Now, this claim has been leveled, I think, in the most famous level, we'll say, recently by Douglas Murray, who's very well known. There's also this Arab-Israeli influencer named Joseph Haddad, who said in one of his videos, and there's a quote, that Ireland has a rich history of anti-Semitism. And you usually see these accusations being made in comment section arguments and Twitter arguments. I wanted this episode to be like a comprehensive breakdown of each of these points and to act as kind of a reference for those who wish to gain the knowledge to dispel these myths when they encounter them. So yeah, I was thinking, and kind of based on like the notes you sent me, I was thinking like chronologically would be the best place to start. Like before World War II and leading up to Ireland's decision to be neutral. Yeah, we'll get into each of the individual points: the neutrality, the IRA collaboration, the not taking in refugees. There's different things that we can point to, but yeah, we'll break them all down across the course of this episode. So yeah, you might take us away. Like after the War of Independence and Civil War, talk to us about Ireland at the time, the lead up to World War II.
Yeah, of course. I mean, that story starts with independence, of course, all the way back in 1921. It's almost unfortunate for Ireland that Winston Churchill had such an involvement in those treaty negotiations, because that is a conflict almost between Britain and Ireland that is resolved in Britain's favour. And what happens in the lead up from independence to 1938, 1939 is the successes, if you like, of the treaty in the favour of the British are being slowly unravelled. And this is angering, many British people, but nobody more so than those who were involved with those negotiations. They feel like their achievements are being taken from them. And Winston Churchill is not a man to take anything lightly, I suppose. He would thunder, I think, is the only way to describe it, about Ireland, more and more so as the years progressed. So, there's really interesting facets of our independence, whereby neutrality was actually brought up at the treaty negotiations. It was a specific point that the Irish raised really early on, that we want the option to be neutral should any future wars occur with Britain. And Britain was very, very clear, no, that is off the table. That is not even a topic of conversation at these discussions. So you can see how important it was to Ireland, but equally how important it was to Britain, and that friction is an immediate point of future conflict, where we're not going to avoid this conversation at some point in our future. It's brought up again as late or as early, if you like, as 1927. There were comments from the likes of Eamon DeVelera, who's now trying to work his way back into power, of course. He's been marginalised. He's made a decision he's not going to take a seat. So he's not putting himself up for those kind of election options. He now wants to feel his way back in, but he's immediately expressing how important neutrality is to him. So when he does get into power in 1932, there could be no illusions for anybody where this is headed, what's going to come next. So Eamon De is setting Ireland on a path from 1932 that will distance itself as much as possible, and with increased achievement really from 1932 until 1938. He's dismantling each and every one of these treaty agreements. It starts off almost with minor things. There's a trade war that goes on between Ireland and Britain. We don't want to be paying the pensions of ex-British servicemen anymore. We're not agreeing to this. It's a pretty fierce trade war which is only resolved in 1938. But, the major achievement of that trade war ending is that we get the return of the treaty ports. Now, the treaty ports were held onto by Britain because they understood the importance, I suppose, certainly as it stood in 1921 and what they had learned in World War One of, I suppose, the advantages of range, the advantages of that kind of strategic approach to feeding the island from America, that they can't do it themselves, that it's a globalized world, that you do require this kind of support. So when those ports are held, it's a bit of a blow for Ireland. It's not the worst. Partition obviously vastly outweighs in 1921, the concern of that. I would even say that the oath to the king is considered a bigger loss, if you like. This is a temporary problem. It's something we can fix in time. And that's exactly what happens. So Britain's return of the treaty ports, it's actually double-sided. It's quite interesting. They saw it as the beginning of negotiations with Ireland to reach a place where we can finally be good neighbours to one another. This can also help to remove the issue of partition. Look how helpful we are. Look how willing we are to negotiate with you to reach a better settlement. That can even lead for a neutral country to, I suppose, the long-term defensive issue that you have. Britain has been worried for 300 years, 400 years, since the age of sail, going that far back, about being attacked from Ireland and Ireland being used as a base. So how do you solve that problem? They've initially tried to solve it by holding onto territory, but there must have been an inkling in the back of their heads that this is always at risk. This is always dependent on an Irish government that is willing to work with you on this. When DeVelera came along, I think they saw those days were numbered. They needed concessions. The treaty ports were one of the concessions, but they probably didn't take in at the time or think about the European environment enough, because they should have had the foresight to see that if a war with Germany came along and you're fighting Hitler, you're probably not going to have done the political maneuvering you need to do to have an arrangement with Ireland that secures your western flank, if you like, that has you safe from that side. So there's definitely mistakes. There's mistakes on the British side to strategize and think about the longer term. It's like they did nothing after 1921, 1922. They allowed almost 2 decades to pass before negotiations begin that really should have been started much sooner, and certainly should have started in 1932 when DeVelera comes thundering, into power, quite clear what his motivations are and what he's going to do. They leave it until 1938 to get a resolution, and it's too late. The gap from 1938 until war breaks out in 1939 isn't enough of a period to solve the problems of what Ireland is going to do and what you're going to do. So what you have there is the environment where Britain probably recognizes it could have done more, that mistakes have been made, that they had an opportunity here that they didn't take. But nobody wants to own up to these mistakes, of course, if you're a politician in power. So there's an area now where there's an opportunity for scapegoating Ireland, if you like. There's a failing on Britain's part to defend its western flank and or defend its shipments coming in. And who better to blame but the belligerent, if you like, Ireland, the people who are constantly giving out about what Ireland is trying to do. So in many ways, that creates this environment that, if you like, Churchill almost feeds into this when Winston Churchill comes into power. Now, interestingly, Winston Churchill was First Lord of the Admiralty from 1939 until 1940, until he came into power. There was nobody more motivated to explain why British losses are so bad in the Atlantic. There's nobody who wants to come up with a better excuse. And he actually writes and requests a report from the Admiralty on why the Irish bases are so important. But his phrasing of this is just incredible. Find me the problems, is simply what he's saying. He's not saying give me an honest assessment on how important the ports are. I want you to tell me that they are a problem so I can report this onward. And the report that has been written has been looked at by a lot of people since World War II, and it's largely agreed that it just doesn't hold up. It's claiming that these ports could have prevented 20% of the losses in the Atlantic. But the entire thesis, if you like, the entire basis of the report is that you would send out these hunter-gatherer kind of attacks against U-boats. When they did eventually try them from other bases, they failed completely. They weren't successful. So your entire basis of this assumption, if you like, that the Irish ports are this important is flawed from the beginning. But all of the evidence points to, and Churchill scholars have accepted this now too, that there was massive scapegoating going on as regards the treaty ports and as regards Ireland's role, if you like. But immediately early on in the war, you can see how an environment has been created where Ireland is the problem. Don't look over here at what Britain hasn't done for the last 20 years. Look here at this, if you like, angry Irish nation, still, if you like, taking on Britain. And we have to remember the IRA had started a bombing campaign on mainland Britain in 1939. It's not winning you any favors, even though the Irish government is deeply against this IRA and they've even outlawed them and they're very hostile towards them to the point of internment and execution. It's difficult, I suppose, to try and defend that, if you like. You almost feel you have to defend it, that it's I suppose, influencing how people are seeing you in other ways. So, that's very much, I suppose, where we find ourselves starting World War II and the declaration of neutrality, which is on the back foot. It really is.
Actually, on that note, a good place to jump in. You'll hear people say Ireland supported the Nazis or Ireland collaborated with the Nazis, when in reality they're saying that this, at the time, fringe group did, and they extrapolate that out to mean everyone. It's usually done kind of lazily or dishonestly or kind of both. Can you give us a bit of an idea of like how much the public would have supported this version of the IRA, and how much their actions and views would have reflected the public or not?
The story of the IRA in World War II in Ireland is really another example of how Ireland was so determined to support the Allies and so determined to maintain its relationship with Britain that it was willing to not only persecute, if you like, I suppose, a marginal group. And they were a small group, very important to remember. There were only about 1,000 active members of the IRA in World War II. To take that in context, it's a country of 3 million. You could hit them all in a dance hall, and you've got the suggestion that they're representative of the people in some way, but the figures completely dispel that. There may have been more sympathizers, maybe a couple of thousand more sympathizers, but not actively involved with it. Now, their popularity, if you like, has been waning throughout the 1930s. They're seen as increasingly irrelevant, really. It's a situation where we have a political agreement, if you like, in place. We have a situation that we have signed up to with the treaty, like it or not. And clearly, Eamon DeVelera, the elected government, do not like it. And he's doing a pretty good job of actually reversing all of those treaty agreements up to the point that when World War II breaks out in 1939, the only thing truly remaining is the fact that we haven't got the North back. It's partition. So, there's a feeling in the public that, well, why would we support violent means to end, partition when we can see we have a government that is actively taking those steps anyway and is very determined to try and reverse that role. So it's reflected in the numbers, most definitely. It's also reflected in sentiment. You pick it up in a lot of the interviews, in the press reporting of the era and the like. There is no love whatsoever given. They're framed as, we would use the word today, terrorists. Not something you would have used back in the day, but very clearly describing them as outlaws. It's harsh. It's criticism. It's a complete reversal of what we would have seen in 1919, when these are our freedom fighters and they're legitimate. They have a democratic, background. They've been mandated, if you like, to deliver independence. So it's strict, it's hard. I always find it incredible to think that the Irish government executed its own citizens for some of the actions that they took while they were members of the IRA. I mean, is there a bigger message you can send about how anti your movements and your operations are? I mean, now 3 of them were executed for murder. And you might say, okay, fair enough, that's a serious crime. That might get you execution for whatever you had, complications you had, or whatever reason you had it. But 3 of them actually hadn't committed any murder. There was plots against the state. They'd been involved, if you like. They'd also been in possession of a weapon. You could deem that harsh if you wanted to. I think a lot of people would have said life imprisonment. You could certainly infer there's a message being sent here. And as for the rest who were arrested, you got certainly in the region of 800 who've been arrested and interned. The evidence against them was usually pretty consistent, but they were certainly taking no chances. And if they believed strongly enough that you were involved, you were going to be spending your time in prison for the remainder of the war. So it is an incredible thing to read, to hear somebody suggest that the IRA is an example of Irish sentiment in World War II, when they were outlawed by the state. They were deeply unpopular with the public, which is representative in the level of uptake, the membership that they had. You really see it in the press, even in interviews with people after World War II, social commentary, if you like, that kind of social history that we get. You just don't experience, the love that you would have had going back 20 years previous. So yeah, certainly to answer your question, the only thing that the IRA, I think, demonstrate in World War II is an Ireland that is committed to its relationship with Britain, to democratic means, to continuing what was achieved after really 1922.
Very good. We'll get into more about Ireland's neutrality in a little bit. Worth mentioning, people sometimes forget this. Like the US, obviously, like they were neutral at the beginning. They didn't join the war to save the Jews or something. That absolutely wasn't the case. So yeah, people will conveniently skip that when they point out the neutrality thing. As we're talking about the IRA, there's be a good place to go like further into it. Can you tell us what you know about the collaboration that did exist? Sean Russell is obviously the biggest name people point to. But yeah, can you go into the extent of the IRA Nazi collaboration?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, yeah, very clearly they have made their mind up quite early, probably in even the lead up to war, that they'd be willing to work with the Germans. And you're absolutely right to point out, I think, the neutrality of the likes of the Americans and all that at the start of the war. This idea that World War II was some moral crusade and everybody jumped in at the same time, absolutely rubbish. What the Nazis did, even from 1932, was in some ways at times a slow unveiling of policy. At other times, it was quite rapid, but it really did take until 1939 and the invasion of other countries to understand the scale. I think we should appreciate the likes of Winston Churchill for the foresight that he had to see the risk. Credit where it's due. Absolutely, the man was one of the first to spot that and call it out. Not everybody was so quick on the uptake. So certainly the IRA are looking at collaborating early days, and the collaboration takes place really in that 1939, 1940s period. They're traveling over to Germany. They're even floating these kind of out there crazy ideas about, assaults in Northern Ireland, escalating attacks, funding dynamite campaigns in the likes of London. They're determined that they're going to strike this blow and that it's going to be effective, but nobody is taking them seriously. They seem to be very disorganized between themselves. The idea is so unpopular with other members of the IRA, or it's perceived that it would be, that the leadership actually keep it secret from the general membership. It's not a generally known thing that this is what we are going to do to achieve our aim, which I think tells you a lot about the confidence that they had, that they probably knew themselves. This probably isn't going to fly with our rank and file membership. Because we've got to remember, if you're a Republican, what's the most sacrosanct part of a Republican? It's the rights of small nations. What's the most important thing is that you must respect the rights of a nation, big or small. Germany has just committed the ultimate violation of small nations by invading its neighbors and the like. How can you support that and call yourself a Republican at the same time? The two don't really marry. But that's the conflict, I think, the likes of Sean Russell and his crew, if you like, at the top found themselves in. And you go back to 1916, this feeling with World War I, it's now or never. Do we strike a blow for Irish independence as we see it, or do we let this opportunity pass? So they've made their decision, they engage, but there really is a half-hearted element to the whole thing of it, John. The Germans, the records of the Germans are still there. They've all been retained, and they are not taking them too seriously. They don't get the impression of an organized group that actually can deliver on what it's saying it can deliver on. And certainly when they send spies across to Ireland to kind of, if you like, investigate how organized they are, can they do what they're going to say? The feedback is absolutely not. This is not something that's going to fly. We probably shouldn't be getting too involved or wasting too much time with this more than anything else. Of course, it's useful, and I suppose every bit of collaboration by the Nazis is going to be pounced upon, and they're going to try and utilize that for various reasons. Politics even can come into it. But as a serious effort to destabilize things, it's not something we would take very seriously. And of course, it falls flat in its face in the end.
I was going to say, obviously, like especially in hindsight, collaborating with basically like the super villains of modern history. There were more, but like it's funny. There's like I think for people who kind of aren't into history, they can probably name like one group of of historical villains, and that's Hitler and the Nazis. They kind of wouldn't know about like Stalin and so on. But okay, so obviously, collaborating with Nazis is terrible. People who are carrying out a Holocaust, absolutely terrible. There is also this principle of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and I'll take any opportunity or any means to get freedom from my country against this like 800-year enemy. That being said, do we have any kind of quotes or any info on whether Sean Russell or the collaborating IRA men had any type of Nazi actual sympathies or any like ideological overlap with them, we'll say?
No, I mean, there's no, absolutely nothing concrete to suggest that John Russell was a Nazi in thought. It purely that he saw the opportunity, as you phrase it, of ending this long-term occupation, this almost obsession with striking a blow against the enemy when the opportunity is there to do so. How can you call yourself a Republican if you don't take those opportunities? Now, as you say, a conflict has arisen here with the enemy, if you like. And this conflict isn't just with the IRA. I mean, you have to look at the Irish government. What a scenario for the Irish government to find themselves in 1939, looking at a global conflict that's developing and coming to the conclusion that the person who occupied our country for these hundreds of years, who retains a part of our island, we feel against our will and something that we were forced into, but they're actually the good guys in this conflict. And they're the guys that we have to work with if our moral compass is in any way going to be, retained. And if what we espouse, democratic principles, the Republican ideals and all that, if you're going to be a true Republican, a democratic Republican, there's only one side to be on here. So Russell finds himself in with the other side of that conflict, and he does, if you like, engage. 100%. There's no evidence whatsoever to suggest that John Russell agreed with Nazi policies, that he was a fascist himself in that, that side. He was an opportunist, is the only way to describe it. And he saw an opportunity to collaborate with this group. Again, like I said, the plans are so badly fleshed out. You wonder if there's almost a half-heartedness to it, if there's how sincere is this? Do they themselves believe that they can pull this off, that they can convince enough people that this is a good idea and that this can be successful? It's all very high level at the start, and it's all within a very small group of people who are not going to be the ones carrying out the work if they ever did get the, I suppose, interaction with the Nazis that they hope to get. You mentioned as well, there was also 1939, 1940. The Nazis are never good. There's never a period in the history of the Nazis that they were a good group. But the Nazis were not so bad in 1939, 1940 that America has declared war against them. That the majority of nations out there have declared war against them. So we can absolutely say it's reprehensible for him to be involved with this group, even at this stage in 1939, 1940. But let's take that in the context of the likes of the Americans haven't yet decided that it's so bad that we need to be ending this and we need to be involved. So, there's more to think about than just the obviousness of the collaboration and certainly the retrospective understanding that we have of the Nazis.
Right. It's funny, I'm pretty sure, I'm not 100% sure on this, but I'm pretty sure that I heard Sean Russell's name for the first time, and certainly this stuff about him collaborating with Nazis. I'm pretty sure I heard it from some kind of semi-viral clip of Douglas Murray, who I mentioned is pretty well known. And the way he phrased it was it's the only remaining statue of a Nazi in Europe. He was giving out that like Mary Lou McDonald was going paying tribute or something like that. This does raise kind of a legitimate question. Like if someone collaborates with X, are they X? If you do want to make that argument, I mean, Winston Churchill, towards the end of it, collaborated with Stalin. So if you want to say that, then there's a statue of a Stalinist and a communist in England. I don't think they would. Just on the type, just your own opinion, like on the topic of having a statue of someone who did collaborate with some of the worst people in history. Now there was a lot more to his life and career than that. Do you think that's ground for maybe like not having a statue of such a person?
Joe, hasn't this been so topical for the last so many years, John? Statues of slavers, people involved in reprehensible things over the years, but then the context of what was happening at their time has to be taken into account. I've always felt that context is everything. So a statue of an individual with the relative description of the individual that does give fair context. I think to me, that's the equivalent almost of what you would find in a museum. And there's very little should be off limits of what goes in a museum. There's no reason why that can't be replicated in public. So if you give people the full story, you give them I suppose, the ins and outs of what has gone on as much as you possibly can in that limited setting that you might have available. To me, no, I don't see the great issue with it. Absolutely, each one has to be taken on its case. And I do think it's important to have that context there. I mean, I went through that experience working at Spike Island, where there's a famous nationalist called John Mitchell was held, and the fort is now named for John Mitchell. John Mitchell was an incredible nationalist. He wrote incredible things. He was cited by a lot of the 1916 generation as their inspiration. He really was important to them. But John Mitchell was also a great advocate for slavery. He went over to America after he was sent out of Ireland, and he would have said, I do not see the problem with slavery. This is a condition that they cannot get themselves beyond. Again, yeah, awful statements, a man of his time. Is it fitting that a fort and an exhibition about John Mitchell, is held? For me, the answer to that is purely down to the context that's delivered as part of that. History shouldn't always be perfectly crystal clear and clean and clear. We don't have to eulogize everybody. We don't have to say a statue is purely eulogizing and it's only saying that this was a good person. So context is everything. It depends on what you give people.
Very good. Okay, so that's the kind of IRA the string of that bow, we'll say. Could you go into for us what Ireland as a country and as a government did and didn't do during World War II? Like obviously on paper they were neutral, but like as you're about to explain, like to actions they really weren't neutral like at all.
No, not at all. And and the reality is the Irish government had a decision to make, but they actually made it before the war, John. I think this surprises everybody when they hear it. The entire story of this was hidden from us because the reality was declassification was put into effect at the end of the war. A good number of documents were 30 years. The majority probably were 50 years, so we didn't get them until the 90s. Would you believe there are still documents declassified on the British side? They've been declassified classified for 100 years, so we're not going to get them until the 2040s. Some great conspiracy theories out there about what they're going to tell us, as you can imagine. So that's going to be one to watch out for. But the biggest ones to be declassified were in 1999. So anything written before that, is written kind of in the dark to a certain extent. It's based on a lot of opinion. What we got our hands on was MI5's declassified documents. What was British intelligence's experience of working in Ireland and being the type of organization they are? They recorded everything. It was minute detail of their every interview with people, their I suppose their emotions, what they were actually doing to help. All of this kept secret. And it's also important to remember that the Irish government, they've taken the decision that they're going to work with the Allies, but they don't want Germany to know this, obviously. I mean, the Allies don't want Germany to know this either, because otherwise Germany declares war on Ireland. You've got another piece of shore to defend, if you like. So what they do is by working with MI5, everything is perfectly secret. You're not dealing with ordinary individuals. You're not even dealing with cabinet ministers, if you like, over in London, who might have loose lips, who might say something that actually reveals something. What we see from the MI5 files is most of the conversations about how Ireland will interact with Britain is done through this secretive channel. And secretive is the word because all of the meetings are held in secret. It's generally done between Irish intelligence services and the MI5. DeVelera is, if you like, feeding plans to them, information through them, and everything goes through that channel. So what the MI5 documents reveal to us, and probably most startlingly, is Ireland approached Britain in 1938, round about September, so long before war even breaks out, and asks for help setting up its own intelligence service with British intelligence officers in Ireland so they can track and capture German spies. Before the war has even begun, we have gone to Britain and we've effectively indicated whose side we are on in any upcoming conflict. So those negotiations continue back and forth, and they do help us set up our own G2 intelligence agency. And as soon as war breaks out, this incredible opportunity for communication is identified and it's utilized. Literally the day after war is announced, secret meetings have been held. We're having the conversation of what are the plans. So what does Ireland, if you like, do? What does it give Britain, I suppose? And crucially, what it shouldn't give Britain, I suppose, as part of this arrangement. So the intelligence thing is quite startling, you know. We give them full unlimited access to every communication in and out of Ireland for the entire duration of the war. Everything. So every wireless telegraphy that is sent from Ireland is routed through London. It's then listened into, and then it goes elsewhere. You know, and that's down to the public. There's no restrictions, if you like, on this. You know, it's enormous. Got no such thing as privacy back in World War II times. You got also every bit of post. And I love this one because we were getting post flown from America and it was landing in Limerick at Foynes Airport. It's then secretly being flown to Liverpool, where it's then being subjected to censorship checks, brought back to Ireland as if it never left. They kept this all under this great veil of secrecy, and then it's issued out to the relevant people. Also, Britain can have the confidence it needs to have, and for Ireland to show, listen, you know, we're not just saying that this is benevolent neutrality. You know, we're being very clear on what our intentions are here. As well, I suppose, with the communications, which are pretty huge ones, we worked with them as we planned to track down German spies, and we were also spying on the German legation. So, if the embassy, as we would call it, it's quite useful for the British, and it's something they don't think about initially at the outset of war. You've got a friendly neutral on your doorstep. You know, in addition to being a neutral that is providing you with all your materials, with all your foodstuffs, you know, 90% of Irish exports are going to Britain at this point. You know, almost everything we do deals with them. So in addition to the fact that this can't be attacked when it's in Ireland and it can't be attacked at our ports, it's only at the point that it's heading to Britain that it becomes, you know, under danger. You've also got German and Italian and Japanese legations going on, embassies in Dublin. So MI5 must have been thinking what a wonderful opportunity this would be to spy them if only we could. But it was the Irish that actually approached them and said, we're going to do the spying for you. They even approached them at one point and said, we're having a bit of a problem here breaking the codes and finding out where the wireless sets are. So they actually sent somebody from London to train up our Irish guys to improve their skills and have them better equipped and the like, you know, able to deal with it. So, you know, you've got this unbelievable level of cooperation on intelligence matters, where, you know, Britain has got complete satisfaction that Ireland is allowing it to operate with impunity. I would describe Ireland as an extension of British soil in World War II in intelligence matters. You know, that's exactly what we were. It was unrestricted would be the only word we could give. And of course, none of this is given to the Germans, and this is not known to the Germans either. You know, these are clear violations of neutrality, which you should not be undertaking. There's actually a great story when it recently came out about a Dublin professor who actually broke the code of one of the German spies in Ireland. You probably came across that, yeah, fantastic. And he shared that with the British, which they know greatly appreciated because that gave them clues and tips and hints of how they might crack some of the other German codes that were going on. So Bletchley Park was very much appreciative when this happened. So look, that's one side of it, the intelligence, you know, it's an important side of it. Again, the access element of it comes up a lot, and so it should. You know, we're neutral, so we're not supposed to allow anybody to access, either overfly our territory, to have access to our seas and the like as well. Germany is told this in no uncertain terms that has to administer it. But not only does Ireland break this, but it actually flips it completely. It gives the British practically unrestricted access to our airspace and our seas. Some of this is vitally important, like what's called the Donegal corridor, where planes departing Northern Ireland could overfly a part of Irish territory without having to go the long way around. And this extended their range into the Atlantic by about 100 miles. So we talked about there the fact that the treaty ports were a bugbear for Winston Churchill. He's giving out that this is an issue, that it's affecting us in the Atlantic. In reality, behind closed doors, we're giving Britain all the assistance we can that isn't going to obviously violate neutrality, you know, by letting them use this overflight, letting us use this area. So in addition to that, going further, I suppose, we actually let the British use our airports. And the key one here is Foynes Air Base. Foynes Air Base was set up only a few years before the war. It's a seaplane base. They're relatively small craft, but still, despite that, about 48,000 personnel went through there in World War II. Now, they restricted press access, which I always find, hilarious. It's a commercial airbase. You're supposed to be selling your flights. But what Ireland had actually done was it restricted Irish people going on the flights. So these seats would be available to British and American personnel. And it's estimated that the vast majority, we're talking more than 90% of the people who used it, were actually British and vital British and American military personnel. They could no longer overfly France, of course, John. Once France has fallen, this is a nightmare for the British. They want to be in touch with Africa, they want to be in touch with other areas, but they can't use those skies anymore. The new route for that becomes flying over to Ireland, then flying down to Portugal and across to Africa. And it's been described as essentially important, at this stage of the war, that they have this, if you like, outlet that they can get men back and forth between this route. So incredible for us to think that it was actually Ireland that they were doing it in. Now, Ireland was so determined to hide it and make sure the Germans didn't find out about it, that they insisted that the military planes did not look like military planes, that anything that was coming in there had to be disguised. They wanted all the personnel that were coming not to be in military uniform. And just in case, they had a big stash of overcoats in the back. And if somebody turned up in a military uniform, you got the overcoat thrown over you, even if it was the middle of summer, and you cracked on and you did what you needed to do. So, ridiculous levels of trying to hide what we're actually doing here. There's actually a great story about a German plane that was damaged and it was flying and it requested permission to land at the airbase because it was in trouble. Again, we would allow this, that's acceptable. Downed airmen can, if they need to make a crash landing in Ireland. The only problem for Ireland was there was about 6 British and American planes there at the time. So had it landed, how do you explain this? What a disaster. There's not 6 of them had to come down at the same time. As it was, sadly for the Germans, the plane actually crashed en route in the Kerry Mountains. It didn't even make it as far as Limerick. But what a let off for the Irish, because it shows how tentative what we were doing were. The reality is we were taking chances with our neutrality. We just didn't need to take them, John, and that's it. You often hear the expression that Ireland was strictly neutral in World War II. There's nothing strict about Ireland's activity in World War II. It is violating that neutrality in so many ways that it's perfectly apparent what it's doing and why, who it's siding on. Well, we're neutral, but who are we neutral on the side on was always the expression.
Let me just jump in there. Do you know of any since obviously the German documents and so on have come on, and was there any indication that they ever knew or were suspicious of what Ireland was up to? Because I mean, they did have spies in Ireland. Now their spies were being spied on and all that, but yeah, is there any historical indication that they might have had a clue about it?
There is absolutely. There's one thing that they got us on. I just mentioned that when aircraft were crashing in Ireland, of course, we weren't going to send them away, so to speak. If a German crew landed in Ireland, they were being interned for the remainder of the war. They were being held. But if an Allied crew landed in Ireland, we were sending them back over the border. We were even towing the bloody planes back up there over the border and sending it back on its way back to the war. This is exactly what the German diplomat in Ireland got wind of and what he heard about. And he felt, of course, compelled that he had to say something about it. We can talk about Herr Hempel in a moment. He's a fascinating character, the German diplomat in Ireland, a man who very much took his role in Ireland to be to keep Ireland out of the war rather than anything else. So he seems to have overlooked a lot of things that were known to every dog in the street about what Ireland was doing. But this was the one thing that he really took us to task for. And he made quite strong threats in his cables with Ireland, quite clear that he needed explanations for this, that he wanted equal numbers of German crews to be released. We're lying, of course, saying that this was a one-off or, a mistake was made, that kind of stuff. As it was, it all came to nothing. DeVelera actually used an instance where a German spy had landed in Ireland to be very cross and say, oh, well, that's totally unacceptable. And, there are clearly things going on that are not perfect on both sides. So that was kind of how he smoothed over that particular one. But fortunately for us, the only other thing that he kind of got news of was the amount of Irish that were volunteering for the Allied forces. And of course, the numbers there were ridiculous. We talk about the accusation that Ireland supported Germany.
no Irishman went to fight for Germany, not one. It's so, there's this really strange suggestion that Ireland was pro-Axis. I've even seen somebody suggest that 60% of Irish people wanted Germany to win the war or pro-Axis. Well, apparently we wanted them to win so much that we sat there and did nothing about it, and not one of us could be bothered getting off our backsides, and going over there. When you take in the members of the IRA, or Irish people that agreed to spy on Germany, it's probably a dozen people in the entire country that actually were active, trying to do something, as we'll say, I don't know, not necessarily even to further the German cause in the case of the IRA, but there just was no sentiment, if you like, in Ireland that I'm so motivated by Hitler or by fascism or by any of this. The largest far-right party in Ireland got about 2,000 members, out of a country of 3 million. It's derisory, it's not even a figure we're talking about. Talking about Ireland and the far-right, talking about Ireland and, a pro-German sentiment, well, the numbers are what speak for themselves there, Now, I can imagine a Republican, the barstool a Republican, sitting there and he reads in a newspaper, oh, Britain got licked in a battle yesterday. There's another setback for the British. And of course, you will have a laugh and you might raise the glass and there can be that kind of an attitude. But the concrete support for Germany, actually being motivated to do something, it absolutely wasn't there. So on the other side of that coin, well, how many Irish people went and actually fought for the Allies or worked for the Allies? It's nearly 9% of the population that is involved in the Allied war effort. It's an enormous number. We reckon somewhere in the region of 60 to 70,000 Irish went directly to the military. So they've left Southern Ireland, they've gone and fought for Britain, engaged directly, if you like, in the military conflicts. Well, as many as 180,000 more have gone to work in Britain. Now that's not a small decision for a country where you're hearing about the Blitz and you're hearing about the attacks regularly and all that. It's a pretty big thing. You've got to have more than a sentiment than just a job, I think, to put yourself into a country that's engaged in a pretty brutal warfare. So it's not an insignificant figure at all. And I think it ably demonstrates that the sentiment in Ireland, it's only going one way. It's very much a case of where our motivation is quite clear and where most Irish people are interested in and what they see as an option. It's so clear.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Okay. So can you talk to us a little about the? I think there was a decision to not take like pretty much not take in any refugees, right?
Yeah. So Ireland. You mentioned the anti-Semitism thing, and you mentioned and that gets conflated with the refugee thing as well. I think people hear that Ireland didn't take Jewish refugees. Ireland didn't take refugees in World War II is probably the shortest way to describe that. The estimated numbers for the total amount that came to Ireland during World War II is 500. 500 is just a derisory number. Now, it's incredible to think that 100 of those are actually Jewish. So 20% of the refugees that entered Ireland during World War II were probably of Jewish descent. Jews made up about 2% of the European population at the time. So there's actually a significant oversized number of Jewish applicants that were received in Ireland versus the overall total of 500. But the key figure that you're looking at there is the very small numbers. That's a policy, John, that was actually in place right back to 1922. When we became an independent state, Ireland decided it was not going to have a refugee policy whereby it would take people in, it would allow them to become a burden on the state potentially for the future. Ireland is an extremely poor nation as it comes out of occupation. Its employment prospects really don't improve during the 20s and 30s. What we operate is a system called aid in place. And that's whereby if you're not ungenerous, you do want to give back to the world, you do want to do something. So we were sending missionaries all over the world, of course, as part of our Catholic Church and, a significant uptake in that. It was a very viable career path for a lot of people back in that time, the first half of the 20th century. But we're also making generous donations. It's not like when we hear of a famine elsewhere in the 1920s that Ireland doesn't fundraise, that it collects clothes, that it sends things out. So when we got to the war and we know this policy that's in place, nobody sees a reason to change it initially. That seems callous when we know what happened in World War II. When we think about the Holocaust, when we think about how wrong things went, we think, God, that's a tragedy that Ireland didn't take in war. And we can say that rightly. It is a tragedy that Ireland didn't take in war. It's an absolute shame. But we have to take it in the context of a policy that had been in place for over 20 years by the point you get to the early 1940s. It's restrictive. It's a very, I suppose, you could use the word selfish if you wanted to. We look at refugee policy very different today. But it's certainly not a policy that is aimed strictly at one demographic only,
Speaking of kind of being a stickler for procedure, would I be correct in saying that, like, DeVelera's, in hindsight, this decision to offer condolences over the death of like the chief freaking supervillain of history in many people's minds. Can you talk to us about what went into DeVelera's decision to offer condolences after Hitler's death?
Certainly, I mean, you can only often describe it as a moment of madness, often described as not reflective of an individual. Certainly, I have an opinion that he shouldn't have done it. But at the same time, it's expressed in public, and it's certainly twisted and conflated by a certain area of people today to mean something it wasn't. And what it wasn't was an expression of sympathy for the Nazis, where there was no sympathy whatsoever. We can say this with absolute confidence, and this would be backed up by British sources as well. The British ambassador, would actually defend DeVelera to a certain extent afterwards and say what he did was it was improper, but mathematically consistent, as in, it was something he perhaps felt he should do. So there's a real layering, I suppose, going on to why he's actually done it. You've got a situation where in the days beforehand, the American ambassador is an absolute nightmare of an individual. He's been very unreasonable with Ireland. He's made threats against Ireland. He has, effectively threatened to take back the ports. He's been a real thorn in the side. He actually was not a diplomat at all. He was a cousin, married to the cousin of the First Lady of America at the time. So he got the role in Ireland on foot of that. He was actually a journalist by trade. He really was a problem for us. And it was he that actually made a suggestion to DeVelera that he was going to arrest all of the German diplomats and have them shipped off to America for, interning and the like. This is completely improper. DeVelera is a stickler for, I suppose, formality, for doing things the correct way. He doesn't like this. When the news of Hitler's death comes in, DeVelera goes to see this particular German diplomat. Herr Hempel is his name. We talked about him briefly earlier. A very interesting character. He wasn't a Nazi. He had to be forced into the party almost, whereby he was told if he wanted to take the Irish role, he would have to join the party. Effectively, he hadn't joined the party voluntarily before this point. His family would say after the war that, he was a proud German, but he was not a Nazi. He did not agree with the policies that he saw in place. So Ireland could probably consider itself fortunate that it didn't end up with, a strict Nazi, if you like, of that nature, who would operate in that way. So DeVelera has developed quite a friendship with him during this time. He's a man of the old world. He's very formal. He's very, reserved. He's very late 19th century rather than, pushing into the mid 20th century. And DeVelera loves this. DeVelera loves an individual who will conduct themselves correctly and the like. So when he goes to speak to him, he does not go to the embassy, which is often put out there. And there's a news report that comes out the following day that contains a lot of inaccuracies. That is part of the problem, unfortunately. I think people see a newspaper and they think, well, that's what happened. And in reality, we should all know they should be questioning anything in the newspaper, and in particular something so soon the day after. Details may not be correct. We don't know what it's based on. It could even be considered relatively throwaway, and that the details are not important. So it's only later on that we kind of see that. They suggested that he went to the legation, which would suggest a very formal visit, that he was going there, if you like, to formally express condolences on the death of Hitler. Now, incredibly, there is not a single official document in existence that says that Eamon de Valera expressed condolences on the death of Hitler. Not one. Even though we hear all the time that that's exactly what happened, nobody could tell you what was said between Hempel and between de Valera when they did actually meet. It's been stated by multiple people that he did offer him asylum, that he gave him the opportunity to stay in Ireland when the war ended. If you like, as a thank you to him and his family, that you have conducted yourself well, that we don't see you as part of this terrible affair almost, that's gone on. And keeping in mind the threat that had just been made by the American equivalent of Hempel, that he's going to have this man arrested and, he's going to have him locked up and all the rest. So that's what DeVelera does. He has that conversation with them. The firestorm is completely understandable and justified. It feels a strange thing to ever sound like you're defending somebody going and doing something on the death of Hitler that could even be perceived as sympathy on the death of Hitler. The reality is there was no sympathy for Hitler in Ireland or in the Irish government at the time. There was also no sympathy expressed for Hitler. There's a suggestion that if condolences took place in the style of the diplomatic, fashion, that the leader of a head of state has now died, and we now need to say we're sorry, we're sorry for the state, we're sorry for the German people, and we wish you well for the future, that should happen no matter what. And that is exactly, the kind of approach, I suppose, that we see DeVelera take, because he writes a letter, and the letter survives to an American friend, and he expresses exactly those sentiments, that those formalities of state should not have anything attached to them other than the necessity of conducting that formality. You mentioned earlier about Stalin. America sent condolences on the death of Stalin. America sent condolences on the death of Chairman Mao. These people probably killed more than Hitler in reality, but we don't talk about those condolences a lot because, as you said, I think there is an understandable, absolutely obsession, almost an escalation when we think we're dealing with these individuals. But that whole DeVelera story has got wrapped up in this wider Irish story of, well, Ireland worked with the Nazis. And then if you hear the name of DeVelera went to the ambassador's residence, or as the newspaper report said, he went to the embassy. It was reported that the flags flew at half-mast. They did not. It was reported that there was a book of condolences and that was signed. There was not. None of these things actually happened. This is just misreporting in the press. It almost sounds like assumptions of what might happen normally when these things go about. But by all accounts, Hempel wasn't expecting DeVelera, wasn't expecting this protocol to take place. So probably none of the formalities, have gone down the normal way. It's best described really by, I think, the academics who really worked on this most as it was a call of courtesy. It's a call of courtesy that reflects a personal relationship between two individuals who have just navigated one of the most extraordinary periods in Irish, German, British, world history, very much so. He would have said it would have been an unpardonable discourtesy not to call on him on the news of the death. That was Devalera's words.
One second, it's very important to reiterate, because when people do make the claim that the Irish were pro-Nazi, or they'll say like they, meaning all of us, it's very important. Like there would be no evidence at all to suggest that like the average Irish citizen would have felt this way, and that DeVelera would be like in some way acting on their behalf, or acting in a way that reflects their views, right?
No, absolutely not, John. Let's look at some of the facts of that, I suppose. Fascism has risen in Europe throughout the 1930s. We've seen countries like Germany, Italy, Spain, Portugal, Greece, Poland, even Japan has fallen to authoritarian rule. Democracies are falling all over the world. Ireland is not one of those, not even remotely close to being one of those. No far right or fascist party gets anything remotely close to a foothold in Ireland. As I said, the only one that was truly established along those lines, Architects of the Resurrection, 2,000 members is all they could muster up. A very derisory showing in the polls. It wasn't something that the Irish people found an affinity with. One of Germany's spies, actually, the head of the Irish National Museum was a German, and he was in place right up until the outbreak of war almost. He was sending back information, kind of a soft spying, if you like. He actually reported back that in Ireland, I'll read it for you, democratic ideologies are strong, as well as respect for America. There is little understanding of and absolutely no sympathy for National Socialism.
this is what the Germans are reporting back. This isn't my opinion. This is what, their thoughts on Ireland are. So again, you think of the key indicators of what the Irish people feel about this war. They're not interested in fascism. They're not interested in the far right. Nobody goes to fight for Germany. No, not one. We don't send any aid. We don't send any, support of any description, anything material in addition to the volunteers. And there was some significant enlistment for Germany, lest we forget, from other countries. You had 50,000 from Spain. You had 60,000 from Latvia. You even had 18,000 from Belgium, which is not a country we typically associate. We always think Catholic Belgium and that kind of side of things. There was even 4,000 who went all the way from India to fight for Hitler. Would you believe that? So, I think it strongly shows that Ireland, it never, ever took it to itself. That, we absolutely, you've got Republicans, as you said earlier, this, we talked about the Barstool Republican, we talked about the anti-British. I'm still angry with what Britain done, and by God, in some cases, they had every reason to. It's only 20 years since the British were burning out homes everywhere, the burning of Cork, many people murdered. If you'd lost a family member, I can imagine you'd open the newspaper and see a British loss and think, well, good enough. Isn't that good for them? But we have to take the number. What matters here is not what people, the little back of your head or that little, oh, well, good luck to them. We have to take the true figures, and you can't stress it strongly enough. There was zero support for Germany, and there was also zero support for the principles of Nazi Germany and Ireland. We just don't see that uptake whatsoever.
Okay, so we'll get on to accusations and the small bit of evidence that exists that people will use to say Ireland was anti-Semitic. It wasn't, but we'll get on to it. Another really interesting aspect is, yes, Ireland was neutral, but this entire island technically wasn't, because the 6 counties of the north were part of still are part of Britain. Which wasn't neutral at all. Can you tell us a bit about the role in the North in this? They interestingly didn't bring in conscription, and I remember reading as well that when Belfast got bombed, Ireland in breach of neutrality, I think sent fire brigades and stuff. Yeah.
It did, yeah. In reality, it's incredible to think. We say Ireland wasn't at war, but of course, we would say a part of Ireland certainly was, very much so. And a lot of the people who enlisted for the British Army, of course, just went over the border. Easiest way to do it. And it was in Northern Ireland that they actually did their enlistment. So, yeah, it's a real quirk, I suppose, of the entire conflict that things have gone that way. It does create problems for Ireland as well. You've got a situation where the Americans are now joining the war later in the war. DeVelera actually complains that you're going to see these American troops coming into Irish soil, as he calls it. I think he's taken an opportunity there to point out his opposition to the occupation of Northern Ireland. But of course, then it's twisted as, oh, he was pro-German. So, that's why he didn't want Americans coming to the country. It kind of goes, it can be twisted both ways, can't it? But certainly, I think overall Northern Ireland it's almost a thorn for both sides, if you like, at this stage. When Eamon de Valera was holding talks with the British ambassador, he would end every meeting by saying to the ambassador, always, come with me. He would bring him to a map of Ireland. He would point at the black part up in the top corner, Northern Ireland, and he'd say, there's the trouble you see. That's what's causing all the issues. I would love to be fighting by your side. I would be active and I would be open about this, but I can't because of that little bit we have up there in the corner. It's actually interesting to hear that's a tactic that was used by Lloyd George when the Irish were negotiating for their freedom back in 1921. He brought all of the members of the treaty negotiating group to a table, and this is where Canada sits. And this is where, South Africa sits. And this, Mr. DeVelera, is where Ireland will sit when you join the Commonwealth and when you join us. You're kind of a visual, I suppose, identification of, where we see your role in the future. And DeVelera is repeating this very physical demonstration of what he thinks the problem is and outlining it to people. So certainly, it's a thorn for Ireland. It's a thorn for both sides. Very much, it's for the British. Of course, the suggestion that Churchill offered Northern Ireland back to Ireland in return for Ireland declaring war. in coming on the side of the British. Now, how realistic he was being, how honest he was being is very much debated, and understandably so. DeVelera had given no credence whatsoever. He asked the question, have you discussed this with the North? Have you discussed this with the Unionists? No, he had not. DeVelera wanted no part in an action that was clearly either going to be a full-on civil war if you tried to force it on people without their permission, or if you hadn't even broached it with them that to be a conversation. No, it was the correct thing to say no. So it does show, I suppose, a recognition everywhere that it was a problem part, I suppose, on all sides.
Why didn't Britain introduce conscription up in the six counties? What was behind that decision?
Very much so, not wanting to anger, I suppose, the Catholic community in the North. DeVelera was very clear on this as well, that it was a bad idea. He actually used that intelligence channel that we discussed. MI5 reported, released in 1999, that it was brought up in their meetings. The anger, the frustration, the problem of conscription actually being brought in Northern Ireland, and the level of distrust and problems it could cause in the South. Pushing more people against the Allies, pushing more people against the British potentially, So I think they identified that it just wasn't worth the trouble. The reality was they were seeing pretty significant volunteer enlistment anyway. You were getting good numbers. It was actually stated by the Irish side in a secret report that we did in 1941. We outlined there was as many as 400,000 Irishmen engaged in defence of the two islands. So we reckon that's about 150,000 from North and South who went to fight for Britain. But you had the bones of 250,000 in Ireland defending Ireland. You can't send everybody off to the front and then expect the Germans to spot an opportunity to, walk into Ireland and open up another flank. So even MI5 agreed with that decision. MI5 at war's end clearly said it was better that Ireland was neutral and friendly in the way that it was, allowing volunteer enlistment. It particularly cited the enlistment in labour, because Britain has sent all its working age men off to the front. They're all engaged in fighting. You had these Irishmen come in and fill those roles in some cases, Irish women too, and it was critical. They were so important as well, John, because they were mobile. Initially when they went over, a lot of them went to London. They're building planes. They're building the Mulberry Harbours. They're involved in what's essential for Britain. But that changes as the war progresses. They need more people in medical care. They need more people to rebuild London as the war goes on. The V2 bombs are falling in 1944 and they're causing untold havoc. 30,000 homes need repairing, people on the streets. It was the Irish starting a long-standing tradition, if you like, of working in London, doing that work. All of that was being jeopardized if you forced conscription on Northern Ireland. I actually think by even as early as 1940, certainly no later than 1941, British intelligence is taking back to Churchill and back to the seniors. We're seeing enormous advantages to having a friendly neighbour of the scale of Ireland, of the friendliness of Ireland, of the approach that Ireland is taking. The British ambassador reported back, DeVelera has offered, he could not offer a more benevolent neutrality than he has offered us to date. So they understood by this point, that was mid-1940, we've got everything we want here, bar an open declaration of war. And what does an open declaration of war actually achieve? It means Ireland is now going to be bombed as well. There's your agriculture going up in smoke. There's the hydroelectric dam in Shannon being destroyed and flooding whole areas of, the food that you so vitally depend on for your success. And again, you turn the goodwill against you as well. You've got a situation where all the Irishmen who were going to go and fight at the front have gone. They volunteered and they're there. What's left is required to defend Ireland. Why would you anger and maybe turn more people over to the IRA as well by having this insistence that Ireland now was to fight on the side of the British? Be cute. And we can talk in a minute why that was the behind closed door understanding that this is better for us. Let's be cute about this. But in public, Winston Churchill is saying very different things, and he's communicating a disadvantage and a problem with Ireland not being neutral. Why is he doing that? We can discuss that in a moment.
Did I read that Ireland's weather reports were helpful for the D-Day landings or something, right?
Yeah, massively so, and that's a very early advantage as well for the British. We're sharing those reports, John, to the point, would you believe, that the RAF were supplying us the planes to do the weather reconnaissance. And there's actually a memo that has survived from the RAF clearly saying the Irish have been in touch again. They're starting to run short on their planes. They're reporting problems in keeping up the frequency. We must maintain the level that the Irish are currently at. Even the challenges we have elsewhere of, servicing these planes and keeping them in the air, we must maintain this Irish goodwill and this Irish link. And how incredibly important that turned out to be, because as you said, as the war progresses and intelligence is playing a bigger part, you're planning not just your bombing campaigns, you're planning your major offensive and when you're going to go into Europe based on these weather reports. So Ireland is giving you an enormous advantage with these head starts. The Germans didn't have this advantage, and they actually had to take submarines and send them out into the Atlantic and take them away from what submarines are set out to do, sinking ships, which is an awful waste, if you like, in some ways, to try and do this. They're also in risk when, of course, they're on the surface. It's a very imperfect system that they have. Britain doesn't have those problems because it has Ireland sharing every piece of weather intelligence that it gets directly over with the British. That's not just, of course, weather reports, that goes into the Coast Watch as well. We mentioned earlier about the intelligence. Ireland has set up a Coast Watch service that goes all around the coastline. It's about 90 spots. They've each covered about 10 miles of coastline. They can see everything. They're reporting every single German movement, be it naval, be it aircraft. It's reported directly to the British, who they know are listening in. It's, superficially, it's sent to Dublin High Command. What are we going to do? Send out our one ship that we have and do something about it? No, we're not. They know full well it's going directly to the British. British planes are intercepting, British planes are engaging. So, it's not just confined, I suppose, these reports that we're giving to the British to the weather. It's a much wider intelligent gathering operation that's going on in Ireland. But the weather does prove vital to D-Day in the end. The Black Sod Weather Report, it's called. It's a Coast Guard station in Ireland that reports you should not. It gives a weather report that makes them decide to not launch D-Day and to delay it for 24 hours. They get the news that there's a break in the weather, and then they go ahead at the right time. And thank God they did. Thank God that information was there. The weather was inclement. It could have been a disaster. Ships colliding, things going really badly wrong. So it just shows, again, it's a small facet, but these things, the incremental of all these little Irish actions. I mentioned the Donegal air corridor earlier. The largest German ship was the Bismarck. It was the pride of the German Navy. It was a ship departing over the Donegal corridor, a plane departing that actually spotted the Bismarck, identified its location and ultimately led to its sinking. So again, these little incremental assistances, if you like, that Ireland is giving along the way that prove so vital in the end, but certainly prove Irish sentiment, was only going one direction.
We won't forget about what you were going to say about Churchill in a second, but just before I forget, there was also, I'm pretty sure I heard this in school when we were learning about the emergency, which is what World War II was called in Ireland. Did the country have a policy of having all the lights off at night so that the German bombers couldn't use it as like a marker or something?
Yeah, that gets brought up. There were two rather ridiculous accusations leveled at Ireland. One was that we were refueling U-boats off our coast. Now, that accusation was made by a unionist politician in the north. I don't want to suggest you're completely biased, but there was zero. He could have zero information that could, he had no way of establishing this. It was clearly a slander, is the only way to describe it. Now, Winston Churchill, in his slightly agitated mindset, said, "Oh, we better investigate it." And of course, they discovered nothing. It was ridiculous. Every litre of fuel coming into Ireland was coming from Britain. Everything was being accounted for, what it was being used on. It was incredibly scarce resource in Ireland. We actually had to convert our trains to run on peat because we'd so little diesel that they couldn't be ran on it. So the suggestion that we had, the equipment, even the material, the diesel itself, it's ridiculous. And the other unionist accusation was that Ireland was leaving on the lights to guide bombers up to the north or to Liverpool. And look, again, this is ridiculous. Ireland, it's coming from a mindset that Ireland in some way favors the Germans. which itself is coming from a mindset that it's so anti-British that it would do so. Now, there is truth in the element of the anti-British element, absolutely, that existed, and it kind of existed. The bigger the proportion of the population, it diminishes in its intensity, kind of. You've got the extremists at the end, barely 1,000 people who are willing to join the IRA. When you get to 50,000 in the population, it's down to, oh, I'm not a fan of them kind of thing. It just goes down and down. It never escalated to the point that we would take actions that would actually actively work against the British, like you say, intentionally leaving on lights so we can guide the bombers. And the suggestion that we would do it to Liverpool, of all places. Liverpool is as much Irish as it is English. We have the closest relationship in the world. There's a love and an affinity, I think, between the two places. So we mentioned earlier the MI5 declassification that actually revealed a really important document called the Cranbourne Report. And that was a British document that outlined how Ireland was going to be treated differently at the end of the war. We were going to be denied the option to join the United Nations in return for declaring war on Germany. We were not going to be given it, but crucially, it had an annex of all the support Ireland was giving, which is quite incredible. You think of the duplicity here. They were going to offer it to Portugal, who was neutral and was aiding Germany. Now, it was aiding the Allies more, but it did give aid to Germany as well. Ireland, who gave zero aid to Germany and gave complete aid to the Allies, wasn't going to get it. But in the list of things that they outlined, of assistances that Ireland helped out with, one of them was actually that we did agree to turn out the lights, that we did agree the coastal areas would be in darkness. It didn't transpire, and we can only assume that it didn't transpire because the British agreed. It was redundant. It wasn't critical. It wasn't in any way, shape, or form going to make that much of a difference to the attacks in places like Belfast, to a place like the north of England, that it was worth doing. Blackouts cost lives. They learned that in the UK. A high number of people were killed during the blackout in London because of darkness, as crazy as it sounds, and the accidents that arose from that. So it wasn't something you did willy-nilly. So there was clearly an agreement that, it wasn't necessary. But we did agree, it's in writing that the British are quite satisfied that we have agreed to this level of cooperation with them again. So completely disparages the notion, the slander, if you like. And there were quite a few slanders thrown at Ireland over the course of the war.
Sorry, just before we got onto these two topics, you mentioned something about Churchill's intentions to discredit Ireland or something. You were just about to make that point.
So there is, John, a really clear plot by Winston Churchill to discredit Ireland in World War II. It stems from a variety of places. We know Churchill is incensed when Ireland declares neutrality. I mentioned that Winston Churchill was involved in the treaty talks in 1921. He's actually the man that goes on the steps of the London area where they were discussing this. He announces to the world the success for Britain of reaching an agreement with Ireland that is very much an agreement in Britain's favour and is very much a disaster for the Irish. So he's very emotionally linked to the Irish story, if you like. He also grew up in Ireland. He spent a few years living in Dublin when he was a younger boy. It's clear he's got an attachment which is not a healthy one. And while it was eventually great for Britain in World War II that he was still in power when Britain went to war, it was a disaster for Irish and British relations that he was the man we had to deal with because he was not rational when it came to Ireland. Despite all the evidence that was presented to him by his intelligence service that we were aiding them, extensively, he refused to believe it to the very end. Always suspicious, investigating these claims that we're refueling U-boats by diverting boats to go and check out to discover exactly nothing. I think a more rational person would have seen where it's come from, a unionist politician, and said, quite clear there's an agenda here and we shouldn't even be giving this credence. And with the assistance we can see Ireland is offering, that's not what's going on, quite clearly. So it starts, if you like, with Winston Churchill very early in the war with the treaty ports. And I alluded to the treaty ports earlier, where this is now a stick to beat Ireland. And Churchill has got a real foot in this one because he visited one of the key treaty ports in 1912, Cork Harbour. He went and visited Spike Island. He saw all of these places that Britain had spent huge money. Britain had spent the equivalent of billions back in the late 1700s, early 1800s, building 3 forts to defend this massive harbour. So having seen it, he thinks it's one of the most important places in the world for Britain to retain and be a strategic asset. When they handed it back, he was incensed. He actually thundered to Parliament. You have given up one of the most important assets we've ever had. He said, you've actually given up the sentinel towers of the defences of Western Europe. Now, that's how important he phrased this. So when we refused to give access to those ports to Britain at the start of the war, he's raging. But he should know full well that us giving access to the ports is a violation of neutrality that is going to bring us into the war. You can't hide British destroyers in your port in southern Cork. It's not an option. It's not even something we can entertain. So he fabricates in many ways the importance of them. He asks the Admiralty to produce a report which grossly inflates the number of casualties, the importance of the bases, what they would have been helped, if you like, by if Britain had these bases. The importance is actually demonstrated by, or lack of importance, if you like, that before the war, we now know that Britain had decided it would reroute all of its shipping north of Ireland if France fell in any world war. That's exactly what happened. France did fall, so all shipping was now going north. The bases down the south have significantly less importance and impact as a result of this, but you're not going to mention this in public. You want it to look like these bases are important, and these damn Irish, these are the problem. These are the people who are not playing ball. It's a great stick. So somewhere along the line, Churchill has come to the conclusion he wants to discredit Ireland to undermine the effort to achieve partition after the war. He's no fool that DeVelera has been gearing up a massive campaign for partition to be ended, and he does indeed enact this effort for partition when the war is gone. But Churchill is going to take every possible step he can to diminish that when the opportunity presents itself. Roosevelt is on board with this, and so is the American ambassador, David Gray. They're quite happy to play up this game that the Irish are not playing ball, that they shouldn't be trusted. We're even going to imply that they're working with the Germans, which is an awful accusation given the reality that's going on. So outside of the treaty ports, the other main way that they do that, they're going on about these treaty ports right through the war, even as late as 1943. And incredibly, we now know that they actually rejected an offer of the ports from the Americans. The Americans said when they were joining the war, we can try to persuade the Irish that you must give access to these ports. And Britain actually said, no, it's more trouble than it's worth. Leave it off. We won't do that. That's what's going on in private. In public, they're saying these are destroying us. These are so important. The Irish are costing us lives is basically the message. There's another way that they decide they're going to say that we're costing them lives. They fabricate a crisis is the way it's described by Warren F. Kimball. He's a very respected Winston Churchill scholar. He's an American. He says they've come up with this idea that we're going to ask Ireland to close the German and Italian legations on the basis that there might be a risk of intelligence going out, that they might know that something. It sounds like a very reasonable request and a very obvious thing to do. And in particular, as you're approaching D-Day and you're approaching 1944 and what might be going on, you don't want any leakage. Now, they make this request, but we have learned from the declassified files that this request was actually made against the advice of MI5, because MI5 advised them, if they didn't already know at this point, we have cracked the German codes in Ireland with the help of the Irish. We have access to every information, a bit of information that goes in and out. Not only that, we are planting information to the Germans, which they are sending back home, which is misinformation. So we have the opportunity to utilize this piece of intelligence, that the Germans have no clue that the Irish are working with us on. It's a great advantage, and it's a rare one. How often could you have that opportunity? So despite this advice from the MI5, don't go ahead with this, they still do. And MI5 actually put in their report, clear as day, which was only declassified 50 years later, this decision was taken, this action was done. So it would be put on the Irish, if you like,
that you have failed to take an action that could save American lives, was the way they phrased it at the time, that you did not comply with what we wanted. So clearly you have pro-Axis and you have pro-German sentiment. It was a plot, nothing less, and it was even a plot that actually put the lives of Allied servicemen, if you like, at risk, because it risked an incredible intelligence sharing operation that was going on. So, it shows you the level of the plot that's going on there. And where that ends, where that culminates, is in Winston Churchill's end of war speech. Now this is Winston Churchill's moment to shine. This is his opportunity to thank all of his allies. This is a chance, I suppose, for it should be a celebration, and it should be nothing less. But to highlight the level of emotion that he has towards Ireland, he actually uses his end of war speech to slander Ireland with accusations that we now know are entirely untrue. He used the expression that Ireland frolicked with the Germans, which is just ludicrous now, with what we know now. He said that because we did not have access to those bases, we may have perished from the earth, was the expression he used. Even Churchill scholar Warren Kimball would describe that as, completely fairy tale stuff. It's unfair, it's illegitimate, it's not backed up by any level of the facts of, what actually transpired. So it's incredible to think that what most people think of Ireland in World War II, it's all built around this intentional slander that was actually designed to limit Ireland's ability to end partition. But in reality, it took down the entire understanding of Ireland's involvement in World War II with it. And we only know what we know now because of these declassified documents from 1999. There's probably been 15, 20 books written since declassification has occurred on various aspects of this. The social sentiment in Ireland, the level of engagement with intelligence, the amount of volunteers and how they were treated and the like. It's only now we're truly understanding what went down, I suppose, in World War II.
Okay, very good. As a final topic, we might go into like let's say if we were to steelman the case that Ireland was an anti-Semitic place, what would be like the strongest evidence that you could bring forward? And then obviously the counter.
Look, you absolutely have to say that there was anti-Semitism in Ireland, at the period. It would be ridiculous to suggest there wasn't. What you're talking about really are levels and comparisons. I can feel crass saying that sometimes, but when there's accusations out there that, when people are stating it at levels that it's just not, and it's not an accurate reflection of history, I suppose then it is important for people like myself who's had a look at what's actually gone on to come in and say, listen, no, I believe you're overstating, and sometimes there can be an agenda behind that overstatement as well, let's be honest. The levels of anti-Semitism in Ireland would have been significantly, massively less than what we saw in Central Europe. You look at Germany, you look at Poland, you look at France, Austria, these kind of places. They're actively taking steps to disadvantage the Jewish communities that they have in their constitutions, to remove them. And we all know where that went eventually, just horrendous things. Ireland's level of anti-Semitism at the time, it's more on a level with the likes of Britain and America. It might manifest itself in slightly different ways, but it's often described as a bureaucratic anti-Semitism almost, a casual anti-Semitism that doesn't, elevate itself to the level of, I would have an anger with a Jewish person if I met them. Because Jewish people in Ireland, not only do they not report no mistreatment, but they repeatedly put public statements out there about the level of excellent treatment that they receive in Ireland. There's glowing, I suppose, compliments, if you like, for Irish treatment of Jews during this time and in the years afterwards as well. It's a very ongoing kind of experience for everybody who's involved. But on the other side of that, we can't ignore what did occur, and I suppose to outline some aspects of it. It's been mentioned about the Catholic Church, and absolutely there were a small number of priests who made anti-Semitic statements in masses. When I dive in to look at that and look at the numbers, you're probably talking a handful of individuals from the 5,000 priests that existed in Ireland in maybe a dozen sermons, and there were probably about 2 million masses a year in Ireland. To say the Catholic Church in Ireland was anti-Semitic wouldn't be a fair statement. Did they put in documents anti-Semitic material, absolutely. Often what we see is Catholic journals in Ireland were getting material from Europe, which has been published wholesale, and absolutely there are elements in there that are deeply unacceptable to us today and should have been at the time. But to go to that level and suggest that we see a physical manifestation of anti-Semitism in the Catholic Church's activity outside of some of that press stuff, and a real handful of individuals, in their practice in Ireland, it's just not evident. It's really not. I suppose the other side of it, as I mentioned, is the public sentiment. You do have Jews that are successful in Ireland. You have a TD, for example, Robert Briscoe, who gets into DeVelera's parliament. He's quite influential and he's quite, I suppose, close with DeVelera. He also, I suppose, is just part of a relationship that Eamon DeVelera has with Ireland's Jewish community. Rabbi Herzog, of course, who is very famous for being the first chief rabbi of Israel, but was actually the rabbi of Ireland beforehand. He has an incredibly close relationship with Eamon DeVelera, to the point that they have dinners together, to the point that they travel to Israel together. It's an immensely close relationship that lasts a lifetime, not just a political career. When DeVelera was rewriting Ireland's constitution in 1937, he asked him to come on board, and they actually wrote the fair treatment, if you like, of Jews and the right to practice the Jewish religion into the Irish constitution. It's one of the only religions named. And at the time, 1937, and we know what's going on elsewhere, this is a remarkable, a step to take, if you like, of your attitude and your endorsement. This certainly wouldn't have gone down well in Germany, an activity like that, but that's not Eamon DeVelera. Eamon DeVelera was quite clear on his stance in this. I suppose you go then further down into that rabbit hole almost, if you like, of levels of society. We do not see mistreatment of Jews on a regular or daily basis or anything like that. We do hear occasional reports of a club, for example, like a golf club. A leader there has decided we're not going to admit Jews. Clear anti-Semitic behavior. You often dig a bit deeper, and it's not confined just to Jews. You actually discover it's all outsiders. So you have an individual who is of that nature. And I think there's an element of that gets confused when people discuss anti-Semitism in Ireland. We discussed the amount of refugees that are left into Ireland, and people say Ireland didn't leave in Jewish refugees, Ireland was anti-Semitic. But by that token, Ireland didn't let in any refugees from any country. So you could apply that same logic to all of those nations and say that Ireland is against all of these nations if you wanted to. Now, so important not to overlook the highest levels of anti-Semitism that we can find. And it does interestingly exist in, I suppose, that refugee policy. There are statements made that we would say we absolutely do not agree with today. I can give you one or two. It's only fair that we do. For example, one made in 1945 by the Department of, if you like, the Department of Immigration in Ireland, to be the modern term. It has always been the policy of the Minister for Justice to restrict the admission of Jewish aliens for the reason that any substantial increase in our Jewish population might give rise to an anti-Semitic problem. So he's identifying that there isn't an anti-Semitic problem in Ireland at present, but if we brought in lots more, maybe we'd have one. Now that is an othering of Jews. That's not an acceptable way to talk about how you would deal with a specific section of the global population, I guess, and we wouldn't accept it today. That was reiterated in a different report. It's the policy of the Department of Justice to restrict the immigration of Jews. The wealth and influence of the Jewish community in this country appears to have increased considerably, and murmurs against Jewish wealth and influence can be heard. As Jews do not become assimilated with the native population, there is a danger that any big increase might create a social problem. So again, we do not think that is acceptable language today, rightly so, for any global demographic that's out there. That has been taken to suggest that Ireland was anti-Semitic. But you've got to dig a little bit deeper than that on what these people are saying. They're acknowledging in both of those reports that there's not a current problem with any anti-Semitism in Ireland, that our Jews who are here are treated well, but they are, if you like, othering them or, differentiating them to say, well, maybe if we got too many in, we could see a problem there on the lines that we have seen in Europe.
You know, do we agree with that? No, we don't. Of course we don't. No, you can't use that kind of behavior. But is that evidence of a country that is anti-Semitic? You know, a country that doesn't have anti-Semitic incidents in terms of violent incidents or, you know, attacks on the street, even though we have a small Jewish population, that has less instances of church anti-Semitism than the UK, for example, that we see, certainly has significantly less public utterances of anti-Semitism than comparatives like the UK and America. No, we don't. No, we just don't see those levels. So again, like I said, it feels so crass talking about something that is, you know, such a topic where the only right amount of anti-Semitism is 0. But when people are saying that it's at 100 in Ireland, you know, during this period, we've got to rationalize it. We've got to look at comparables. You know, Ireland was not Central Europe. Ireland was neither violent, you know, aggressive. It was not putting it into its constitution, quite the opposite. It was protecting the freedom of the Jewish faith in its constitution. So, you know, you've got to take it at a level, the low level, I think is a fair word to describe it, that it was at in comparison.
Probably the single biggest anti-Semitic incident in Irish history, I think, seems to be this pogrom that took place in Limerick. You can tell us a bit about that, but like in a lot of cases, the exception kind of proves the rule. The fact that there was only one to point to, and not only that, but like if Ireland was an anti-Semitic country and they heard about a pogrom, an anti-Jewish pogrom happening somewhere, then surely it would kind of spread like wildfire, or it would at least happen one or two other places because they would hear about it and feel emboldened. But the fact that it didn't actually kind of proves the opposite in some ironic kind of way.
It's true, you know, again, a fascinating incident, you know, sad, reprehensible, obviously absolutely awful. You hate to see it. You know, it's interesting looking at it that it stemmed from an economic argument that you actually had a number of local traders that went to the local priest. They're complaining that they feel these Jewish traders have an advantage. That is what they're elaborating. That priest then goes in a sermon and comes out with your typical awful anti-Semitic arguments. Yes, no, the Jews are involved in this, they're involved in that they're efficient at this, you know, it's terrible language. And it does lead to what's, at the time, it was called a boycott. And for most of the last 100 years since, you know, 80 years since, it was classed as a boycott. Really, it's only recently that people have started to use the term pogrom. You know, there were some violent incidents. There were one Jewish man was attacked. There were stones thrown at some people. You know, it did escalate beyond just word call, name calling, which is terrible. But it's interesting to see where it develops from. You know, I suppose if we were to take an example of what the Jews themselves thought of that incident, there is the best chronological, if you like, of Jews in Ireland is a guy called Louis Hyman. He was a Jew himself. He lived in Dublin for all of his life. He would have actually been, you know, he would have had first-hand experience, if you like, of what Ireland was like, and also what the Limerick Pogorm was like. This was part of his upbringing. You know, he would have known the entire incident. His description and his summary of the event is, it was a sad but uncharacteristic and atypical episode in Irish history. You know, this is a man who has written the history of the Jews in Ireland, and his feeling on it is does not represent Ireland's normal, you know, levels of anti-Semitism, its approach to Jews, you know, all that kind of thing. To him, it is a standout, separate thing that does not reflect in reality how Ireland is typically behaving towards its Jewish population. You know, it's on the other end of the scale is his feeling in his book. He wrote The Jews of Ireland in 1972. So he would have been very close to that World War II era, you know, would have grown up with it all, would have understood all that side of things. You know, even in the newspapers that you see coming reporting on it, you know, there was less picking up on the anti-Semitism, while some that did report it picked up on the economic element. Oh, well, is it unfair that there are advantages from individuals? You know, which could then lead into somebody saying, oh, the Jews have advantages, which is anti-Semitism, that's not acceptable. And others agreeing with the Limerick traders saying, oh, no, we do see an unfair economic situation here. That does need addressing, but we're not going down, you know, we're not having that conversation that, you know, that Jews are in any way different or the othering that you would accept. So, you know, I would 100% agree from what I've read elsewhere on the Jewish experience in Ireland, and that's taking Jewish people giving their experience. That's from the diaries of the Jews themselves. They would typically say that it was a sad but uncharacteristic episode in Irish history.
It's worth mentioning that this hasn't just happened with Jews, but it did happen a lot with Jews in Europe. There's a role in economics called a middleman role, and often when it's done by a minority group, it's called a middleman minority, and that's when it's often like kind of, like we'll say buying and selling, like buying something for £1 and selling it for two. And if you're not economically literate, then it's easy to see this and just think, oh, exploitation. They're just like they're just like charging us more than they get it. But in reality, there's a cost of keeping the business open, and the stuff that gets lost or stolen or doesn't get sold, you have to make up for that and all that. So yeah, it does actually work out. It's worth mentioning that this has happened not only with Jews but with Chinese, who have gone all over the world and fulfilled that role, with Armenians, with Lebanese too. So yeah, this I don't know if it played into the Limerick one that much, but yeah, Jews have in a lot of places fulfill this middleman minority role, and that, if you don't understand how business works, then you'll be left thinking that they're just like exploiting you or charging you more, that kind of thing. Yeah.
Exactly, and that very much was expressed. It really did come about as a result of economic grievances, is the only way to describe it, from the local traders, which is interesting. And it's sad that it went down that route because of a priest, if you like, almost then clearly with this latent, if you like, anti-Semitism that he had, this opportunity of, if you like, brought it out in him, which, the Catholic Church is influential. It's led to an escalation. But it's very difficult to take that isolated incident and try and apply that to a country where that's not the reported experience of those who are the others who are here.
Absolutely. Okay, so I think we've covered just about everything. If there's anything else you want to throw in, that's grand. Tell us about like your own background in history.
Yeah, certainly, God. I've been fascinated in history since I was young.
John, it's something I've always had an interest in. I was very lucky to grow up with a family of storytellers in West Waterford. You got every story about, the Free State, about, the IRA, that real kind of an Irish upbringing, and that old school style. So inevitably, I think I was going to go into history.
I was actually incredibly lucky, if you like, that I got a job working
in history when I managed Spike Island, which is a fabulous tourist attraction in Cork. A rich history across, if you like, Ireland's role in the empire, Irish nationalism, so much went on there. It was a British fort in the lake. So that was my first book, and that's very much what, I suppose that cemented me now in a career in history. And it's interesting that Spike Island was, of course, one of the treaty ports. So that's kind of what got me down this World War II aspect. I actually came across, I feel like, the reality that Ireland in World War II was being completely misrepresented as far back as 2019. And I've been pulling away at all those different little bits, if you like, of that, those different aspects, up to the point of publication. Look at publishing as a co-author on a book, probably by the end of this year. And I'm looking to do my own book on the subject. I really want to focus on that slander that was leveled against Ireland, how influential it's been for the last 100 years, that people, if Winston Churchill says something, the British listened. So if he said their product with the Germans, good luck to you trying to say that they didn't, and calling Winston Churchill a liar. But now we have, if you like, the supporting evidence. Now we have the declassification that shows that. So absolutely want to set the record straight on that. So that's going to be my next work. I've actually got a book as well coming out, would you believe, on Irish symbols and the Irish tricolour. The first history of the Irish tricolour is coming out next year, which is a fascinating story on its own.
Before mentioning, I discovered you and most of the evidence that counters the claim about Ireland being pro-Nazi and anti-Semitic. I discovered most of that through this Twitter thread that you posted. I think the other day you kind of went through a lot of it again. But yeah, I was using that for the basis of researching this. We'll include your Twitter in the bio. Yeah, well worth following. Was there anything else about the subject at all that you wanted to leave the listeners with?
So we'll go from the top on this one. So there's a really interesting aspect to the American intelligence when they joined the war, and they actually started linking up with Ireland, because they don't actually know what Irish sentiment is. You have to remember, they're not involved. They have question marks. Winston Churchill is telling them and acting like Ireland is a big problem. It's probably even pro-German, it's pro-Axis, these kind of stories. So they actually send spies to Ireland to try and ascertain what are the Irish thinking, what is the sentiment. There was a guy called Martin Quigley who had actually been in Ireland before, so he was ideal. They sent him over on the pretense that he was making films, and they got him an interview with him, DeVelera, some of the key characters. Now, this guy was blown away by what he came across, and he told them that what you have been told is a complete fallacy. It's just not accurate at all. He would later write, he actually wrote a book on the subject. He said that openly the position was that of pretending neutrality in the classic sense, but actually it was a neutrality against the Axis in favor of the Allies. Clear as day, this man felt that we were supporting the Allies extensively, exclusively. The director, if you like, then of what would eventually become the CIA, they were called the OSS at the time, the Office of Secret Services. So they get in touch with the Irish, and they're optimistic. They're wondering, are we going to get a bit of collaboration here? They're absolutely overwhelmed with the level of information that they get them. Apparently, the Irish desk, which only had like 1 or 2 people on it, had to be expanded because Ireland sent them across years worth of intelligence gathering, of movements of agents. Most crucially, they provide them with all the German shipping movements and all the German aircraft movements that's now so important to all these Americans coming to join the war. The Irish are actively engaged on the coast, looking out to the Atlantic and taking this in. It's all dumped on the desk of the Americans to say, here's what you need, here you go. I think there's a great quote from the acting head of intelligence in Europe at the time, J. Russell Forgan. He said the Irish cooperated with the United States on intelligence matters as if they were allies. They have never received the credit due to them. He was very clear in what he felt, and he even was part of an effort that would see some of the Irish intelligence agents receive American commendations, that they would actually be honored by America for how closely and how openly and how well they worked with them. But it was refused by the Irish government because they didn't want the reality of Ireland's, one-way aid to the Allies and this cheating, if you like, on Germany to come out. Which, it's a shame almost in hindsight that we've had to go through all these decades of misinformation. But it's great to see that it wasn't just the Irish, it was the Americans as well that very much understood very quickly what way our sentiment went.
John, thank you very much for coming joining us. Great. Now, I was really hoping for a good like around about 2 hours of a comprehensive drilling into. It's funny, like with history as well. It's very easy to just kind of use snippets and form a whole like view over that. But then, if you're not actually drilling into it, you're really not getting the full story at all. So thank you very much for helping with that. Tell us a bit about the Spike Island book that you have. If people are more interested in your work, that they can go get that.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, no, again, a fascinating subject. Spike Island has been a monastery, a fortress, a prison, and a social home for the last 1,300 years. It really became interesting in the late 1700s when the British started building forts there. And probably the most expensive construction project in Irish history started there in 1804 when they built an enormous 24-acre fortress. That saw action in the Napoleonic Wars, if you like. It was manned during World War I, World War II, and of course, World War II, it became so controversial because it was one of the treaty ports. But again, the military is just a small side of the history. It was also used as a prison on 4 occasions. Would you believe it was the largest prison in Irish history in the 1840s? There was 2,500 people held there. So it was a famine era prison, but the scale was just enormous. And an important one as well, it came up with the system of parole, played a very important part in, I suppose, future penal ways of doing things. So yeah, fascinating subject. If anyone wants kind of a good understanding of, I suppose, Irish history through the eyes of one location, it's a great way to do it.
Very good. Can't wait for your books, your future books to come out, and I'd love to have you back on the show when you do.
Brilliant. Appreciate that. Thank you so much, John.
Thanks, mate.